Welcome to Thalira Tales, where stories bloom in silence, carrying emotion, mystery, and hidden truth. Step in and let the tale unfold.
On Friday night, I arrived at my sister-in-law's company launched, the kind of event where I was expected to smile, stand in the right place, and not make anyone uncomfortable when my phone buzzed. A message from my assistant. Just one line: don't go inside. Go down to the parking garage, open the black briefcase alone. I stopped, went down, took it. And the moment I opened it, I could barely breathe. For 4 years, I believed I understood the man beside me. After that moment, I didn't stand still anymore, because I knew that from this second on, everything he built would begin to fall apart piece by piece. The fact that you're here, it matters more than you know. Tell me where you're watching from, city or country, leave it in the comments. I read them all. Before we begin, this story draws on fictional elements for narrative and educational purposes. Characters and settings are constructed. The lessons woven through them, however, were meant for exactly the person watching this. Chicago has a way of being cold that no other city quite manages, not the kind of cold you fix with a heavier coat or an extra layer. This is the kind that settles deep into your bones and stays there patient and unhurried, like it has somewhere to be and sees no reason to rush. That Friday evening in October, driving south on Michigan Avenue with the wipers working overtime and the city lights bleeding into long yellow streaks across the wet pavement, I felt every degree of it. My name is Sloan Mercer. I was 35 years old, and I was on my way to smile through a party I had been dreading for 2 months. The event was the grand opening of Voss Interiors LLC, a boutique interior design firm founded by my 29-year-old sister-in-law, Delia Voss. The venue was the Grand Ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton Chicago 8th floor, overlooking the northern end of Millennium Park. The guest list ran 300 names deep: commercial developers, architects, old real estate money, a handful of people from the design press. It was the kind of launch that doesn't happen on talent alone, and I knew exactly what it had taken to make it happen. $1.8 million that my husband had moved out of places it didn't belong and into accounts that had no legitimate reason to exist. Also, his younger sister could stand under crystal chandeliers and call herself a business owner. I knew, and for tonight I was supposed to smile and pretend I didn't. The dress I was wearing was pale, almost white, but not quite, more of a washed-out champagne that did nothing for my complexion and everything to make me disappear in a crowd. Garrett had selected it himself 2 weeks ago, pulling it off a rack at a boutique on Oak Street with the kind of measured care you could mistake for thoughtfulness if you weren't paying attention. "You'll look elegant," he'd said. "And you won't overshadow Delia." I remember looking at that dress and thinking that's the most honest thing he's ever said to me. The wipers cut another arc across the windshield. Outside, Chicago rushed past in the particular blur of a Friday night, couples ducking under restaurant awnings on Wabash. Limos doubled parked near the hotel's tourists who hadn't yet learned that October on the lakefront punishes optimism. I turned the heat up another notch. It didn't help. My phone rang at 7:47 p.m. Loretta Voss, my mother-in-law. 66 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of a voice sharp enough to cut glass at 30 yards. She was already at the Ritz-Carlton, had been there since 6. I was certain, positioned at the best table, orchestrating the room like a general who had confused a dinner party for a military campaign. I let it ring twice before answering. Not long enough to seem rude, just long enough to take a breath. "You're late," she said. No greeting, she never bothered. "I'm a few minutes behind schedule. I'll be there before 8. The family should have arrived together." What are people supposed to think seeing Garrett up there alone? Somewhere in the first year of this marriage, I had learned that arguing with Loretta Voss was like arguing with weather, exhausting, pointless, and nothing ever changed. The woman had opinions about everything: how I dressed, how I spoke at dinner, how I arranged fresh flowers, how I stood in a room. Once, she made me rewash 3 of Garrett's dress shirts because she could detect at some molecular level I apparently didn't possess that I had used the wrong cycle. I brought them back to her clean, folded, and said nothing. "That was what you did." "I'll be there shortly," I said. She was still talking when I ended the call. 90 seconds later, Garrett called. Of course he did. If Loretta was weather, Garrett Voss was infrastructure: cold, functional, built to last, and completely indifferent to whether anyone found it comfortable. We had been married 4 years, and in that time I had learned the precise shape of his voice when he was managing me versus when he was speaking to someone he actually respected. Those two voices sounded nothing alike. How far out are you? 2 minutes. Reginald Wentworth is already here. You know who that is. I did. Reginald Wentworth, commercial real estate, Great Lakes region, the kind of man whose handshake carries more actual weight than most contracts. He and his son Sterling had brought the right names to tonight's guest list. Garrett had been cultivating that relationship for 2 years. I know who he is. Then you know to stay out of the way. Stand where I put you. Don't make tonight about yourself. The line went dead. There was never a goodbye. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were dry. They had been dry for a long time now, but the redness around them told a different story. The thing about crying is that at some point your body does the math and decides it is no longer worth the expenditure. I had reached that point somewhere around year 2. The car turned onto East Pearson Street. Ahead, through the rain, the Ritz-Carlton Chicago materialized out of the dark, all warm amber light and dressed limestone. The kind of building that costs money just to look at directly. A valet in a burgundy uniform was already moving down the entrance steps toward the arrival lane. My phone buzzed. A text. Ingrid Cassell. Ingrid had been my father's personal assistant for 19 years before she became mine. 52 years old, precise as a Swiss watch, loyal in the way that only 20 years of shared history can produce. In all that time, across 2 decades of working inside the Mercer family, she had never once sent me a message that wasn't completely composed and measured. The text read, "Do not go inside yet. Valet is holding a package left for you. Check it first. Alone." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. In 20 years, Ingrid Cassell had never sent me anything like that. Not once. The valet was waiting at the bottom of the steps. 8 floors above the chandeliers of the grand ballroom blazed through the rain-streaked windows, warm and indifferent to everything happening below. I tightened my hands on the wheel, not from fear, from something colder, cleaner, and far more deliberate than fear, something that had been quietly building for a very long time. Tonight was not going to go the way anyone had planned. Frederick Gould was the kind of professional you only find at certain addresses, the type trained to make every inconvenience feel like a service, every unusual request feel entirely expected. He was 44, burgundy uniformed, and carried himself with the particular composure of a man who had spent 2 decades ensuring that whatever people brought through those doors, he would handle it without commentary. He held the stairwell door and said quietly that the item being held for me was in the lower-level storage area if I didn't mind, not the public lobby, the secured section below, reserved for VIP arrivals. I followed him down. 1 floor, and the world changed entirely. Gone were the chandeliers, the piano music warming up somewhere on the 8th floor, the smell of white lilies arranged in crystal vases. Down here it was concrete and fluorescent, and the faint chemical residue of motor oil and wet asphalt. The ceiling pressed lower. The overhead tubes buzzed at a frequency just below comfort. I had been in parking structures like this one before, built into the original bones of old Chicago buildings. Retrofitted with keycard panels and security cameras, but never quite stripped of the feeling that they had existed long before the glamour above them. Frederick led me past a row of black SUVs to a narrow alcove near the base of a concrete support column. On a metal storage shelf between 2 hotel-tagged luggage pieces and a sealed mailing box sat a black leather briefcase. A woman dropped this off at approximately 6:30 this evening. He said in the carefully neutral tone of a man who understood that the contents of packages were none of his business. She asked that it be held for Mrs. Voss. Said you'd know what it was. Did she give a name? No, ma'am. She paid cash for the hold service and left within a few minutes. I signed the receipt. Watched him cross back toward the stairwell. Listened until his footsteps were gone. Then I carried the briefcase to the hood of the nearest vehicle and set it down. The latches released without resistance. No combination lock. Whoever had packed this had not bothered. Inside 3 small velvet boxes, deep burgundy, arranged in a neat row across a cream-colored interior panel. I lifted the first box and opened it, and the fluorescent light struck the stone inside and fragmented into small points of blue across the concrete ceiling above me. My mother's ring. The square-cut sapphire set in white gold pavé commissioned by my father for their 25th anniversary, worn on her right hand until the day she could no longer lift it. The ring that Garrett had told me 8 months ago, quietly before dinner, had been taken from our home safe during the February party. I had spent 3 days convinced the fault was mine. I had cried over this ring. I had apologized to my husband for losing it. It had not been lost. The second box held an emerald pendant on a platinum chain, the piece my grandmother, Eleanor Mercer, had worn in her wedding photograph 60 years ago. The third, a set of white gold bangle bracelets, custom-made that my mother had pressed into my hands on my 21st birthday, with specific instructions never to sell them regardless of what life required later. I closed all 3 boxes and reached beneath the cream panel. The documents were printed on heavy legal stock, clean and deliberate. First page, a purchase contract for a River North penthouse priced at $3.8 million, signed by a buyer named Tatum Reeve. I should be clear about who Tatum Reeve was. Not a colleague, not a client. She was the woman my husband had been involved with for the better part of 2 years, a fact I had quietly confirmed months ago through means I never shared with him. Second document. An asset transfer certificate listing 3 commercial properties totaling $22 million in value, signed at the bottom with my name in someone else's handwriting. Third, 2 business-class boarding passes, O'Hare International to Zurich. Departure tonight, 11:45 p.m. Printed names, Garrett Voss, Tatum Reeve. My phone rang. "Tell me," I said. Ingrid's voice was controlled in the particular way she had always been controlled, not detached, but precise. Hotel security gave me access to the lobby camera footage during our technical setup this evening. I went through the events coordination team as a standard security review for tonight. They didn't ask questions. Lobby cameras are public area recordings, so there was no legal issue. She paused. At 6:28 p.m. a woman entered the main lobby from East Pearson Street. She walked directly to the valet desk, handed over the briefcase, gave your name as the recipient settled the hold fee in cash, and left. Door to door, 4 minutes. Tatum Reeve. Yes. She knew the hotel, the entrance, and the name you'd be listed under. She knew exactly what tonight was. I said nothing. This wasn't careless. Ingrid continued. The jewelry is reported stolen, insured, missing on paper. The transfer documents carry your forged signature across $22 million in assets. If investigators start looking for Garrett, they find you standing in a parking garage holding items you can't explain. It creates confusion. It buys him days before anyone untangles it. By then, he's already landed. That was it then. Tatum Reeve was not simply the woman my husband had chosen instead of me. She was the person who had designed my arrest. One more thing, Ingrid said. The external camera on East Pearson before she entered the lobby, it caught her standing on the sidewalk for approximately 3 minutes, making a phone call. To who? I haven't confirmed that yet. Keep working on it. Already am. I ended the call and looked at my watch. 7:57 p.m., 3 hours and 48 minutes until that plane left the ground. I looked at the 3 velvet boxes lined up on the hood of a stranger's car, the forged documents in my hand, the parking structure humming around me with its cold light and its indifferent concrete. Somewhere above me, a ballroom full of people was applauding a man who had already decided this city was finished with him. He had planned everything, the exit, the distraction, the woman he left holding evidence. He had built this night piece by piece with patience and precision. What he had never once seriously accounted for was what I might do when I found out. That I now understood was his only real mistake. To understand how that briefcase came to be in my hands and why I hadn't seen any of this coming until it was already arranged around me, I have to go back 4 years. Back to a May evening in Grant Park when a man who knew exactly what he was doing walked up to a woman who had no idea what was about to begin. May 2020, 31 years old. 3 weeks and 2 days after the worst morning of my life. My father, Ellsworth Mercer, died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in April. He was 63. He had built Mercer Capital Group from a single-room office on North Clark Street over 30 years, assembling it deal by deal with the kind of measured patience that made everything he touched look permanent. He was the type of man who made the world feel legible, who could look at a distressed property, a stalled negotiation, a difficult quarter, and explain clearly what it meant and what came next. When he died, that legibility died with him. What was left was a 31-year-old woman who had just inherited a company she was not ready to run, sitting across from a desk that still smelled faintly of his coffee. 3 weeks later, because the company did not pause for grief, and because I was the only person left to stand in for it, I was in Grant Park in a black dress that was slightly too formal and a smile I had been rehearsing in the car on the way over. Mercer Capital held a charity gala every spring, a fundraiser for affordable housing development on the South Side, an event my father had founded 11 years earlier. I was there because 300 people expected someone with the Mercer name to show up and look like the future of the firm. I was not ready to be the future of anything. The evening had the specific beauty that Chicago earns a few times a year when everything finally cooperates. Mild air off Lake Michigan. The skyline lit clean against a darkening sky to the east. Fairy lights strung between the tent poles glowing warm gold against the grass. The jazz quartet was playing standards I recognized from my father's study on winter Sunday afternoons. And when they moved into a particular song, something slow and low that he had owned on vinyl since before I was born, I had to set my glass down on the nearest table because I couldn't trust what my face was about to do. I found a gap near the edge of the tent, positioned myself with my back to the crowd, and looked out toward the lake. Just breathed. "You look like someone who's working very hard at pretending to be fine." He was standing a few feet to my left, facing the same direction. Not toward me nearby, as though he'd arrived in that corner of the park for entirely his own reasons and simply found me, already, there. Early 40s. Well-dressed without announcing it. Dark jacket, no drink in hand. He wasn't looking at me when he said it, which was the specific detail that kept me from ending the conversation immediately. "Is it that obvious?" I said. "Only because I recognize it," he said. "I've stood in that same spot at enough of these." He introduced himself as Garrett Voss, a mid-level development manager in one of Mercer Capital's regional divisions. He said it plainly without positioning, and then asked whether my father had founded the gala or inherited it from someone else. I told him the whole story, the South Side Initiative, the first event with 40 people and a folding table, how my father believed developers owed a debt to the communities they operated inside. Garrett listened, actually listened, in the specific way that means a person is tracking what you say rather than constructing their next sentence. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "He sounds like someone worth missing. No advice, no condolences dressed as wisdom, no version of everything happens for a reason, which I had already heard at least 40 times in 3 weeks. Just that he sounds like someone worth missing, and it was somehow the only thing anyone had said to me since April that felt completely true. I stayed in that corner of the tent for another 40 minutes. The weeks that followed operated at a distance I would later recognize as precision. He brought coffee to the office twice on evenings when my car was still in the garage after 7, he'd noticed. He said, and didn't think twice about it. He sent a single text the night before Mercer Capital's first full board meeting without my father's name on the agenda. "You've got this." Nothing more, nothing less. He did not call uninvited, did not appear at the apartment door, did not attempt to convert my grief into an opening. He simply placed himself within reach consistently, at the exact calibration where genuine and calculated look indistinguishable from each other. When you are sinking in grief, and someone holds a hand out above you, you don't stop to examine their motives. You don't assess the current or the angle or what it might cost you to reach back. You simply do because it's the only thing available that makes sense when everything else is going under. That is the mistake I made. The most expensive one of my life. What Ingrid found years later, what she eventually set down in front of me as part of a folder I will tell you about in a moment, was that Garrett Voss had not wandered to that corner of Grant Park by chance. His presence at that gala that evening beside that particular grieving woman with that particular inheritance was not coincidence. In May 2020, I didn't know that. I knew only that someone had shown up at the right moment and said exactly the right thing. And then, walking back across the grass toward the parking lot at the end of the evening with the music still moving slowly over the water behind us, he said something else. Something I believe the way you can only believe things when you have nothing left to be skeptical with was the most honest thing a man had ever offered me. I know now it was the first knot in a rope he had been weaving for months before we ever met. A rope doesn't announce itself. That is what makes it effective. 1 thread looks like warmth. 2 look like consistency. 3 look like a person who shows up when they say they will, who remembers small things that other people let go, who asks the questions that make you feel as though someone is actually looking at you rather than through you. By the time you understand what you're holding, the weaving is already finished. By August of 2020, the weaving was well underway. The months between the Grant Park Gala and the evening at Alinea followed a pattern that I experienced as organic and now understand as architecture. Garrett became, gradually and without apparent effort, the most reliable presence in my peripheral life, reliable in the specific way of someone who has mapped exactly where the openings are. He knew the board meeting schedule because he was Mercer Capital's staff. He knew which projects were running over because he worked adjacent to them. He was never intrusive. He was never absent. By September, I had stopped noticing that I thought about him when he wasn't in the room, which is the sign that a foundation has already been poured. Alinea sits on North Halsted Street, 3 Michelin stars prix-fixe. The kind of restaurant where dinner takes 3 hours, and the room is quiet enough that you keep your voice modulated without thinking about it. Garrett had made the reservation 6 weeks in advance. I found that thoughtful at the time. I understand now it was a detail in a sequence of details each placed with intention. He ordered the wine. He waited through the first 2 courses. And then, with the timing of someone who had rehearsed the pause, he set down his glass and told me something he said he had been afraid to bring up. He was afraid, he said, not of the relationship, not of me, but of how it would read from the outside. He had come from nothing, he said. His mother had worked 2 jobs through most of his childhood. He had spent his entire adult life building a professional reputation from a starting point that gave him no advantages, and the work that represented he did not take lightly. If we moved forward, if this became what he hoped it might, every person in Chicago real estate would look at him and categorize him instantly. There goes the man who married the Mercer heiress. Not a professional, not a person. A footnote. His voice wasn't entirely steady when he said it. His hands were still on the table. Everything about the delivery was precise. He had a proposal regarding the company, he said. Not about us specifically, about structure. What if Sloan stepped back from public leadership, remained the true owner? The actual decision-maker in every matter of substance, but allowed him to carry the CEO title in name. It would protect his credibility in the field. It would let him feel like a partner contributing something real. She would lose nothing functionally. He would gain the one thing he said he needed: to stand in a room of peers without being reduced to her husband. I'm not asking you to give anything up, he said. I'm asking you to let me be useful to something that matters. I heard a man protecting his dignity. I understand now. I was hearing stage directions written before he ever learned my name. That night I called Ingrid. Ingrid Cassel had worked beside my father for 19 years. She was 48, meticulous in all things and constitutionally resistant to enthusiasm she hadn't personally verified. When I finished explaining the arrangement Garrett had proposed, she was quiet for a measured 10 seconds. Then she said, 2 conditions, not negotiable. The first concerned the company. Mercer Capital Group would remain held inside the Mercer Family Irrevocable Trust, a legal structure established before the marriage, which under Illinois law classifies the assets within it as non-marital property. Illinois handles divorce through equitable distribution, meaning a court determines what is fair rather than dividing everything equally. But property placed inside an irrevocable trust prior to marriage sits outside the marital estate entirely. Garrett could carry the CEO title in perpetuity. He would hold no equity stake, no ownership interest, not a single percentage point. He would be legally and precisely an employee of the trust. Nothing more. The second condition concerned the house. Our Lincoln Park residence would be placed inside a separate structure, the Mercer Residential Trust, with my name, Sloan Ann Mercer, as the sole trustee. Garrett's name would not appear on the deed, on any mortgage documentation, on anything with a property interest attached to it. He signs a director-level employment agreement, Ingrid said. It gives him the operational authority to run the company on behalf of the trust. It does not give him equity. It does not give him ownership. If the question ever arises, he works for you. Because under every document that actually matters, that is precisely what he does. I agreed to both conditions. They seemed at the time like legal caution, Ingrid being careful in the way she was always careful. I signed what needed to be signed. I didn't look closely at what I was protecting myself from. We married in November. Small ceremony. 20 people. The ring was a family antique he had sourced from an estate sale in Lake Forest. Beautiful, deliberately understated. Selected so that no one could say he had spent beyond his station to make an impression. I thought it was considerate of him to think that way. I understand now it was branding. 3 months before the night I stood in that hotel garage, Ingrid placed a folder on my desk. Inside was an invoice, authenticated by the private investigative firm she had retained from a Chicago-based executive placement company called Spencer & Associates. The payment recorded on the invoice, $40,000. The client, Garrett Voss. The nature of service rendered. Expedited placement into a mid-level development position at Mercer Capital Group. The date on the invoice, November 2019. 5 months before my father died. He had paid to be inserted into that building. He had researched Ellsworth Mercer while my father was alive, while the company was operating at full strength. Before there was an inheritance to speak of, or a grieving daughter standing alone at a charity event who needed someone to say exactly the right thing. He had manufactured his position inside Mercer Capital before the opening he intended to exploit even existed, because he had anticipated it. He had built the platform before the stage was set. Garrett Voss was not a man who recognized an opportunity. He was a man who constructed the conditions for 1 year in advance, and then waited with extraordinary patience for the piece he needed to fall. How deeply I had been wrong was exactly proportional to what it cost me to find out. But in November of 2020, standing in a room of 20 people with a ring being placed carefully onto my finger, I knew none of it. I saw a man who seemed to have chosen me deliberately, and I confused that for something it was never going to be. The woman who walked out of that ceremony was not the same one who would walk out of a parking garage 4 years later, holding a briefcase that changed everything. The woman who walked out of that ceremony walked directly into 3 years of dismantling. It didn't begin immediately. The first 4 months had what I can only describe as a surface temperature pleasant enough if you didn't press too hard cooler beneath. Garrett was attentive in the way he had always been attentive, which I now understand as maintenance. The performance required upkeep to remain credible, and he provided it without appearing to try. Then in March of 2021 he told me his mother and sister would be moving in. He did not ask. He told me on a Monday evening with the tone of someone announcing a logistical arrangement they had already finalized. Loretta and Delia Voss arrived that Friday, with 4 large suitcases, standing opinions about the kitchen layout, and the collective assumption that the Lincoln Park house, my house, the one legally held inside the Mercer Residential Trust under my name alone, had just become their permanent residence. Loretta walked through the front door and assessed the interior, the way a property inspector assesses a building methodically, with invisible notes being taken. Within 20 minutes she had identified which cabinets she preferred, claimed the east-facing guest room at the end of the hall, and determined that the weekly grocery run was now my responsibility. She didn't ask. She organized. She had the particular authority of someone who had spent 40 years never being challenged on home territory, and had been proven right about that every single time. I had prepared something to say. I had rehearsed a version of it in the car on the way home. But Garrett was standing in the kitchen doorway when Loretta spoke, and the expression on his face made clear without a syllable that whatever I was preparing to say would be treated afterward privately, patiently, as a failure of character on my part. That was the architecture of his method. He never raised his voice. He never made threats that could be named or remembered with precision. What he did was interpret. After every incident with Loretta, after every conflict with Delia, after every moment when I attempted to name what was happening inside that house, he would sit across from me and walk me through his analysis, always the same analysis, differently arranged. I was still processing my father's death. My emotional responses were running above baseline. I was reading hostility into situations that were simply at their root family adjusting to new circumstances. He wasn't dismissing my feelings. He was contextualizing them. He was trying to give me perspective. 2 years of that, and I stopped trusting my own read on situations. That is what systematic gaslighting actually costs, not the argument in the moment, but the slow erosion of your judgment until the day you reach for it and find it unreliable. I had been, before all of this, someone who trusted her instincts as a matter of professional survival. By 2022, I doubted them on principle. One morning in October of that year, I woke with a low fever. Nothing serious: headache, elevated temperature, the ordinary misery that resolves in a day. Loretta appeared at the bedroom door at 7:30 and informed me that Garrett's dress shirts needed hand washing before his 8 o'clock meeting. Warm water, she specified. Not hot. I walked to the laundry sink and washed them, standing with both hands in the water while the room tilted gently because my temperature was reading at 101. I hand-washed 4 dress shirts belonging to a man who was legally precisely on every document that mattered, an employee of my family's company. That evening, I described what had happened to Garrett. Carefully. No accusation. Every word selected. He listened with the patience of a man who had already prepared his response, and then he said, "Hi, she's from a different generation. That's her way of maintaining order when things feel uncertain. I'd appreciate it if you could meet her partway." I went to bed without answering. That was the night I understood with complete clarity that he would never position himself between his family and me. Not once. Not for any reason. Not ever. Delia operated on different terms. In early 2022, she came to me with a proposal an interior design consultancy described with genuine energy and no documentation whatsoever. She needed $280,000 to get it moving. I transferred the funds from personal accounts separate from the trust, because she was my sister-in-law, and because I was still trying in those months to build something that functioned like a family. The money was never mentioned again by her. When I raised it 18 months later, Delia cried with Loretta. Loretta brought it to dinner as evidence of my inability to be generous toward people who needed help. Garrett ate quietly and offered nothing. People assumed I stayed because I was afraid to leave. The actual calculation was more practical than that. If I had filed for divorce in 2022 without documented proof of financial fraud, Garrett would have had every reason to challenge his termination from Mercer Capital through civil litigation, wrongful termination, contested employment terms, breach of the director-level employment agreement. Civil discovery in Illinois is broad. A sustained lawsuit would subpoena internal corporate records, financial structures, ownership documentation. The private arrangement at the center of Mercer Capital, the one that protected everything my father had built, would have become a matter of public court record. Business partners would have questions. Contracts with trust-sensitive clauses would have been at risk. I would have damaged the company protecting it, so I stayed. Not because I was trapped, because the cost of leaving badly exceeded the cost of leaving well. Every Sunday morning before the house was awake, I took out a folder I kept in the back of my desk drawer. Inside was the original Mercer Capital founding charter, the 30-year-old document with my father's handwriting in the margins, and his signature on the last page. I read the preamble every week, the part where he described what the company existed to do, and for whom. 4 minutes beginning to end. It kept me oriented when everything around me was working to make me lose my direction. Then came August 2024. I was walking past Delia's room when her voice came clearly through the door mid-conversation, unguarded, no awareness of anyone in the hallway. Garrett already wired the $1.8 million. Yeah, I know where it came from, but honestly, that's not my problem. We're 2 months out from the launch. She had no idea I was standing 3 feet from that door. I kept walking. Down the hall into the kitchen to the counter where I stood until my breathing was steady again. Delia knew. She had known the money wasn't clean from the moment it arrived. She had accepted it because the ceiling of a grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton was worth more to her than the question of what had been done to produce the floor beneath it. In that family, no one was entirely without fault. No one. I went to my room, closed the door without a sound. I didn't cry. I'd exhausted that resource years ago, but I thought about Ingrid somewhere in this city that night, turning the pages of a file she had spent months building piece by careful piece. And I understood something clearly. For the first time, what I had been doing for 3 years wasn't waiting. It was preparation. That August evening, standing in the hallway outside Delia's room while her voice came through the closed door, was the moment I recognized what I had actually been doing for 3 years. But understanding a word and knowing the weight behind it are two different things. For the second, I have to take you back 1 month. Back to a Tuesday afternoon in July when Ingrid called at 2 o'clock, and her voice was calm in the specific way that told me she was carrying something she could no longer hold alone. Intelligentsia Coffee's Millennium Park location keeps a small private meeting room available for select accounts, 4 seats, a door that closes completely, walls with enough insulation that the sound dies within a few feet of the threshold. Ingrid booked it under a corporate name she maintained for exactly these purposes. I arrived by taxi rather than my own car, wearing a wide-brimmed hat I kept for the occasions when I needed to move through Chicago without being visible as Sloan Mercer. She was already seated when I came in. On the table in front of her, a red folder thick enough to suggest months of accumulation, and beside it, her tablet screen already active. 2 cups of coffee. Neither had been touched. She didn't offer a greeting when I sat down. She waited until I had closed the door and settled before she spoke. "I need you to prepare yourself," she said. "Then I need you to let me get through all of it before you respond." From Ingrid, that sentence meant something significant was about to land. The first folder contained Mercer Capital's Q2 financial report for 2024. Not the reviewed version Garrett had signed for the board, but the raw figures Ingrid had independently reconstructed with a forensic accounting firm she had retained outside of any company-vendor relationship. The number that opened the summary page, $47 million, moved out of Mercer Capital in the preceding 18 months through a network of 23 vendors across 6 states, categorized in company records as procurement expenses, consulting fees, and market research costs. Every transaction, Ingrid said, was kept below the company's internal compliance threshold for enhanced review. Under the framework that Clifton Greaves approved in 2021, any payment under $250,000 in those service categories passes through standard processing without triggering an automatic second-level audit. She paused to let that settle. None of these transactions were large enough to flag the system. She explained the design of it carefully. Under the Federal Bank Secrecy Act, financial institutions are required to identify and report patterns consistent with deliberate transaction structuring. The practice of intentionally keeping amounts small to avoid attention is itself a federal offense called structuring. What had been done inside Mercer Capital applied the same logic internally. Each payment was sized to pass beneath the company's own review threshold, then distributed across enough vendors and geographies that no visible pattern emerged to anyone examining only a portion of the accounts. And because Mercer Capital is a private company not publicly traded, not subject to SEC quarterly reporting requirements, there were no mandatory public disclosures where an outside analyst might notice the aggregate figure. Who approved the compliance framework? I said. That brings me to Clifton Greaves. I knew the name. Clifton Greaves had served as vice chairman of Mercer Capital's board since before my father's death, a position he'd held through 2 leadership transitions. What I had not known until this afternoon was the precise sequence of his elevation. In early 2021, Garrett had recommended to the full board that Clifton be appointed chairman of the Internal Audit Committee, the body responsible for overseeing financial reporting integrity and determining what information reached the full board for review. The recommendation had passed without objection. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable administrative decision. What it actually accomplished was positioning Clifton at the single point of control between the company's internal auditors and the people who were supposed to hold Garrett accountable. As committee chairman, Ingrid said, he controlled what got escalated. Anything he classified as resolved at the committee level never reached the full board. Anything that generated an unresolved query, he handled it internally. In January of 2023, Clifton had also overseen the replacement of Mercer Capital's long-standing external auditing firm, a Chicago-based practice that had worked with the company for 20 years and understood the complexity of its holding structure from the inside. The stated reason, cost reduction. The replacement, a smaller regional firm with no prior experience in layered real estate holding entities. The new firm's audit for fiscal year 2023 had generated several unresolved technical queries. Clifton had represented to the committee that each one had been addressed. The full board had received a clean summary. The old firm would have known what to look for, I said. That's why they were replaced, Ingrid said. She opened the second folder. This one was a private investigator's report compiled by a firm Ingrid had used for background verification work since my father's time. Every one of the 23 vendors was a shell corporation, a registered legal entity with a registered agent's address, no employees, no business operations, and no verifiable commercial activity of any kind. The beneficial ownership filings traced through the layers of holding structures beneath each vendor converged on a single registered name. Hector Bain. Tatum Reeves' personal driver, Ingrid said. He's been on her direct payroll for 3 years. I sat with that for a moment. $47 million moved through a structure registered under the name of a woman's personal driver. 2 years of watching Tatum Reeve in rooms she had no professional reason to be in raising at once, with Garrett being told I was manufacturing problems out of ordinary professional relationships. That conversation had cost me 3 weeks of doubting my own perception. Now there was a PI report, a beneficial ownership chain, and a name I could place. There's something else, Ingrid said. She did not reach for a folder. 6 weeks ago, Tatum Reeve retained a criminal defense attorney, privately not through any contact connected to Garrett, a lawyer who handles white-collar financial crimes specifically. I confirmed this through court registration records and a source with direct knowledge of the attorney's current client matters. She's protecting herself from exposure, I said. She's protecting herself from something, Ingrid said. The question is, which direction she's running. She said it without interpretation, which was her way of telling me she genuinely didn't know yet. I looked at what was spread across that small table. $47 million. 23 shell companies, a compromised audit committee chairman, a woman with her own criminal defense lawyer, and a motive for silence that was becoming increasingly unclear. "Is this everything I said. Ingrid was quiet for just long enough to mean no. "Not yet," she said. She lifted the tablet from the table and turned the screen toward me. On it was the opening frame of a video, the image dark lit only by a dim amber glow from somewhere off camera. The room visible in the background looked like a basement, not the kind that appears on any official building plan. "I need you to watch this," she said. She kept her eyes on my face. "But first, I need you to promise me you'll stay in that seat until it's finished." She had asked me to promise before she pressed play. Watching the first 4 seconds of that video, I understood why. The footage came from what appeared to be a fixed wide-angle camera positioned above, and to the left, angled down at a broad table with a worn green felt surface. A basement room, exposed brick along the far wall ceiling, low enough that the standing men near the edges of the frame had roughly a foot of clearance. The amber glow of hanging industrial fixtures reaching the center of the table and dying well before the corners. The kind of space that doesn't appear on any building's public schematic because it isn't supposed to. The audio was surprisingly clean chips against each other in stacks. The low murmur of multiple conversations, a woman's laugh, somewhere off to the right. The timestamp embedded in the lower edge of the frame placed this in early spring, roughly 3 months before today. At the center of the table, jacket off, and folded over the back of his chair sleeves pushed to the elbow, sat Garrett Voss. Not the version of Garrett Voss I saw at 7 in the morning reviewing quarterly projections over coffee. Not the composed, calibrated man who had spent 4 years managing every impression in every room he entered with the patience of someone who understood that perception was a full-time occupation. This version had his collar open, his tie gone entirely, and his eyes reading somewhere between red and glass, the specific look of someone several hours into substances that had started well and were no longer cooperating. He was laughing, the particular laugh of someone performing ease rather than feeling it too loud, too continuous, directed at no one specifically. The chip stack in front of him moved twice during the 4 minutes and 37 seconds the clip ran. It ended lower than it started. I waited until the screen went dark before I spoke. "Where did this come from?" Ingrid placed the tablet face down on the table. "Not from us," she said. "Filming in a private location without the consent of those present would violate Illinois recording law. The state requires two-party consent for audio and video capture in any space where individuals have a reasonable expectation of privacy, and a members-only club, however illegal its actual operations, qualifies." She kept her voice even and precise, the way she spoke when she wanted to make absolutely certain something was understood. This footage exists because the FBI has been building a case against a network of unlicensed gambling operations across Chicago. This location in West Loop is one of several properties they've had under active federal surveillance. I have a contact with indirect access to that investigation who made a portion of the footage available off the record. It is not evidence we can introduce. It is not in our chain of custody. When this situation moves toward federal involvement, and I believe it will, the Bureau will collect everything they need through legally obtained search warrants. This video serves one purpose only, so that you know the truth of what has been happening. I looked at the tablet lying face down on the table and thought about every evening of the past 2 years I had been told there was a late meeting, a site walkthrough, a working dinner with partners in the western regions. "How long I said. "The financial irregularities suggest the gambling began seriously in mid-2022. The acceleration in the first quarter of this year indicates it had become unsustainable. The timeline assembled itself without effort. The embezzlement hadn't been the original plan executed on schedule. It had been a response to mounting losses that a salary couldn't absorb, covered instead by withdrawals from the company he had engineered his way into specifically for this purpose. A scheme that had always been about extraction, forced into its final desperate phase by a compulsion that had grown faster than the system could service it." Ingrid turned to the next document. A single-page formal legal layout, heavy stock paper. A promissory note. Garrett Voss as borrower. Viktor Morozov, Capital Partners as lender. Principal $8,300,000. Executed in March of 2024. Due in full by October 31st, 2024. Collateral listed in the agreement's terms as, and I read the language word for word, family assets and professional standing as represented by the borrower. I read the lender's name slowly. Something in my memory reached for it, not quite landing. Viktor Morozov, I said. Ingrid didn't respond right away. She let the name hold the air between us for a moment. Then quietly, before your father died, did he ever mention that name? At any point during that last year, I thought back. There had been a period roughly 12 to 14 months before his heart attack when Ellsworth Mercer had been unusually contained. Not withdrawn, my father didn't do withdrawal, but quieter than normal, more deliberate. He had been working on something significant. I had known that much. A partnership. A deal larger than most of what we handled. It had fallen apart. He had said very little about why, and I had not pushed, because in those months I had been focused on other divisions and had trusted him to tell me what I needed to know. There was a transaction, I said. Something large. It collapsed before I understood the full picture. Ingrid opened the final section of the red folder. A 3-page investigative summary from the forensic firm. The deal had been worth $200 million, a commercial development consortium that beneath its public-facing corporate structure was connected to Viktor Morozov's financial network. My father had examined the underlying entities and refused to proceed. The documentation of his reasoning existed only in private notes, but the conclusion was clear. Ellsworth Mercer had seen something in the structure that made the partnership untenable, and he had walked away from $200 million because of what he'd found. For a man like Viktor Morozov, that was not a business decision to be respected. That was a public dismissal that required a response. The response was not a confrontation, it was a campaign. Anonymous correspondence to my father's long-standing business partners, carefully worded, never explicitly threatening, but the kind of communication that installs doubt about a counterparty's reliability in ways that are difficult to directly refute. Contracts that had been progressing towards signature were quietly redirected to other developers. A minor regulatory inquiry never substantiated, never resulting in any finding that nonetheless demanded 18 months of legal attention. Individually, each event had a plausible explanation. Viewed together in sequence over 11 months, they composed a deliberate architecture of professional erosion. His cardiovascular history, I said. His physician's records show a significant deterioration in that 12-month window, Ingrid said. The heart attack was classified as natural causes. At the time, there was nothing to indicate otherwise. What the investigative record shows is a sustained, coordinated pattern of professional and reputational stress applied to a man with a known pre-existing vulnerability over the course of roughly 11 months. She paused. I cannot promise you a prosecutor could build a provable case from this. The chain of causation is indirect, and the intent is difficult to establish beyond the documentary record. But I want you to understand what this looks like when you can see all of it at once. I sat in that small room with the dark window and the cold coffee and the red folder on the table between us, and I did not cry. I had learned by then that the feeling of something breaking and the feeling of weakness are not the same thing. The first one had earned its place and didn't need to apologize for it. My father had not died because his heart had reached its natural limit. He had died because someone had made it their systematic project to exhaust him until it did. And I had been standing at a charity gala 3 weeks after his funeral, being carefully approached by a man who had placed himself inside my father's company 6 months before any of this began, and I had known nothing about any of it. I looked at Ingrid. And my husband owes $8.3 million to the man responsible for this. Yes, that's the worst of it. She held my gaze without agreeing. The pause that followed was not an oversight. The worst of it, she said, is that he knew. He knew who Viktor Morozov was before he ever signed that note. He knew the history between Morozov and your family. He chose that lender with full knowledge of what that name meant. I looked at the promissory note lying on the table. Then none of this was coincidence, I said. No, Ingrid said. It never was. There are truths that once heard leave no room left for feeling. Not because they are insignificant, because the part of you that could receive them has already been used up by everything that came immediately before. Ingrid had one more folder. 6 months ago, she said, Mercer Capital's IT security team identified a minor breach in the company's server, a misconfigured permission setting that briefly exposed a private email archive before the vulnerability was corrected. The archive belonged to Garrett. Because the incident report crossed my desk as part of standard oversight, I became aware of what the exposed folder contained. She placed 3 printed email chains on the table between us, text only. I had copies made before the archive was resecured. The dates ran from late January to early March of this year. I read them, The language was careful in the way people are careful when they understand that what they are writing shouldn't exist but are writing it anyway, because the person on the other end is not in a position to produce it in a courtroom. The contact was a financial intermediary, a name that recurred in the FBI's documentation of the Morozov network. Ingrid confirmed. Garrett had initiated the exchanges. In the second email, he had referenced the Mercer name explicitly, not as a complication, but as a selling point. As a quality he understood would generate a particular kind of interest in a particular kind of audience. He researched Viktor Morozov before approaching him. I said. He did. And he researched your father's history with him, not as a warning, as a tool. She explained the calculation precisely. Viktor Morozov had held the outcome of the deal with Ellsworth Mercer as a personal injury for 4 years. His financial network operated entirely outside formal legal systems, which meant the verification processes that any licensed lender would apply as a matter of regulatory obligation were, for Victor, not requirements, but choices. And here was Garrett offering him a transaction that arrived packaged with something no interest rate could quantify. The prospect of watching the Mercer name implode from the inside serviced by someone already embedded in its structure. Victor would not examine the collateral carefully. The non-financial reward being adjacent to the collapse of a family that had publicly dismissed him was itself a form of payment that skewed how he weighed the risk of imprecise documentation. This was the architecture of the double trap. If Garrett executed the plan, cleanly, extracted the assets cleared, the Morozov debt departed before anyone had assembled what had happened. He had his money, his escape, and a clean ocean between himself and accountability. If the plan fell apart before he could exit, Morozov would come for the collateral. The collateral, as represented in the documents Garrett had fabricated, pointed to Mercer Capital Group and its associated residential assets. Viktor Morozov did not operate through courts or attorneys. He operated through the kind of pressure that is applied personally and without legal intermediary. In that scenario, the person at home, the name on the trust documentation, the face of the family was Sloan. Either result removed Garrett from the direct line of consequence. Either result placed Sloan inside it. The collateral he pledged to Morozov does not legally exist, Ingrid said. What Garrett submitted was a fabricated document set representing himself as the 100% beneficial owner of Mercer Capital Group through a chain of holding structures he invented. He presented this as legitimate to secure an $8.3 million loan. Victor accepted it without performing any legal due diligence. No independent title search, no attorney review, no cross-reference against the public corporate filings that would have identified the actual trust structure immediately. She paused. In part, this is because Victor's lending operation is itself illegal and cannot invoke courts to enforce anything. In part, it is because Garrett had accurately predicted that this particular lender's hatred of your family name would outweigh his instinct for caution. Creating and presenting those documents constituted fraudulent misrepresentation to obtain credit, a federal charge independent of and additional to the embezzlement offenses. Victor's acceptance of unverified collateral without performing basic due diligence was precisely why he was now a subject of the same federal investigation that had produced the casino surveillance footage. Now, Ingrid said, I need to be completely precise about your legal position. She opened the final page. Theodore Baxter's letterhead across the top. Mercer Capital's lead outside counsel, 49 years old. A man who had worked alongside my father for more than a decade on every significant transaction the company had ever executed. Theodore had prepared this document today, July 15th. You have held suspicions about financial anomalies since approximately 2022, Ingrid said. Under federal law, suspicion and knowledge are not the same standard. A co-conspirator charge requires knowing and willing participation in the offense. Reasonable suspicion, even strongly held suspicion, does not satisfy that threshold. What you have had until today is suspicion. What you have as of this conversation with this documentation in front of you is confirmed knowledge. Today is the day that changes. She kept her voice level. Theodore's declaration establishes July 15, 2024, as the date you received confirmed evidence of the fraud's existence and scope, and as the date you initiated a documented evidence collection and reporting preparation process. That process is due diligence. It is the correct legal response to learning what you have learned today. It is categorically not concealment, and any federal prosecutor worth their position will recognize the difference. The declaration ran 2 pages. It named the date, specified that I had held no confirmed knowledge of the fraud prior to this meeting, and established the beginning of a documented chain of conduct that would demonstrate when the time came that I had acted correctly the moment I knew. I asked when we would move. When Garrett is in a position where he cannot leave the country before a federal warrant executes, Ingrid said. Until then, nothing changes. You go home. You make dinner. You give him no indication that this meeting occurred. That is what I did for 3 months. I went home from that cafe on a Tuesday in July, and I cooked dinner, and I sat across the table from Garrett Voss, and I listened to him describe a board meeting, and I nodded at the right intervals, and I said almost nothing because saying almost nothing was a skill I had spent 4 years developing without ever intending to. His original plan, Ingrid had estimated, was designed for 6 to 8 years. 3 years building operational credibility in the CEO role, another 3 to 4 of accumulated asset positioning, carefully structured to appear legitimate enough to survive scrutiny in an equitable distribution proceeding under Illinois law, then a divorce, then a protracted legal dispute over what could be argued to belong to the marital estate, a fight that without the trust structure Ingrid had insisted upon in 2020, he might have had some chance of winning. The gambling reordered all of that. By 2022, it had become a liability that accelerated faster than the extraction could service. By early 2024, the Morozov deadline had compressed 8 years of deliberate planning into 4 rushed ones. In his haste, he had left seams, transaction patterns slightly too regular, shell company connections slightly too traceable, documentation that held together until someone who knew exactly what they were looking for had the time and the access to look. He had constructed a precise, patient scheme. Then he had slowly dismantled it himself one evening at a time in a basement room in the West Loop. I left that cafe not knowing what the triggering event would look like. I only knew I would recognize it when it came. And then it was a Friday in October, and I was standing in a parking garage under the Ritz-Carlton with a black leather briefcase resting on the hood of a stranger's car. And my phone had a text from Ingrid, and the briefcase was already open. That was the moment I had spent 3 months waiting for. I looked down at the folder in my hands and realized I hadn't yet reached the final page. Behind the asset transfer documents, behind the forged signatures, and the boarding passes, and the 3 velvet boxes containing what remained of my mother's jewelry, there was a second set of materials, printed on the same heavy legal stock as everything else, assembled with the same methodical care. I moved the briefcase from the hood of the car to a wall ledge, angled it toward the overhead fluorescent light, and kept reading. What I found was not what I expected, and being wrong about it told me something important. I had assumed the fabricated paperwork was designed to frame me to construct a durable case, however thin. That Sloan Mercer had been a knowing participant in the financial architecture Garrett had built. I had assumed that was the purpose. I was wrong about its ambition. The documents were not built to withstand serious scrutiny. Any competent forensic accountant brought in within the first week of investigation would have identified the inconsistencies in the signature sequencing, ink pressure variations across the forged pages, timestamp metadata embedded in the electronic originals, and the fact that 3 of the transfer orders referenced account authorization codes that predated my listed clearance level by 7 months. This was not the work of someone intending to permanently deceive the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. It was the work of someone intending to delay them by approximately 3 to 4 weeks. Garrett had not designed this to destroy my reputation permanently. He had designed it to introduce enough interference into the opening phase of the investigation that the first 2 weeks became a process of establishing who was and wasn't involved, rather than a process of tracking where he had gone. While investigators spent their initial bandwidth clearing my name, which they would ultimately do, but not without time and paperwork, he would be 4,000 miles away, managing the extradition window through channels that measure delays in months rather than days. And there was more. Attached behind the final page was a 2-paragraph memo. It outlined a plan to leak a selected subset of the fabricated documents to a financial journalist based in Chicago, anonymously through a third contact after departure. Enough to introduce a shadow owner narrative into the press cycle before the investigative picture had clarified. Enough to generate questions about an unnamed controlling interest operating behind the CEO role. The goal was not press coverage for its own sake. The goal was confusion in the critical 4-week window before a formal extradition request could be drafted, transmitted, and received. Obstruction of justice. Wire fraud. The plan was not naive. It was a delay mechanism with federal exposure attached to every component of its execution. I stood under the fluorescent lights of that parking garage and let what I had just read settle. Then I smiled. For the first time in 4 years, something in my face moved without calculation or performance behind it. Not warmth, nothing close to warmth. A cold, quiet, entirely composed expression that I had no name for until that moment. The expression of someone who has just confirmed that the person they have spent 3 months preparing for has miscalculated the one variable that cannot be compensated for after the fact. He had built his plan around my paralysis. He had expected the shock of discovery to overwhelm my capacity for rapid response. He had engineered the night's opening move, the briefcase at the valet desk, the chaos of the documents. The fear of finding myself holding fabricated evidence with my name on it to keep me standing still long enough for him to reach the departure gate. He had not accounted for 3 months of preparation. I picked up my phone and called Ingrid. She answered before the second ring. "I've been waiting," she said. "I just finished reading the confusion package." I kept my voice at the same register I used in board presentations, even precise, no excess in either direction. His plan is more complete than I gave him credit for, but it only works if he boards that plane. Understood. And I have an update on Tatum Reeve. A short pause. She finalized a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois 3 weeks ago. Full cooperation on the wire fraud and conspiracy counts in exchange for reduced sentencing consideration. Tonight is the public-facing event she has been waiting for the moment the agreement moves into its active phase. I thought about the briefcase sitting on that valet shelf with my name on a card attached to the handle. The trap Tatum had helped design, delivered to me in a hotel lobby on the night she had been waiting to use as her exit. "Let her come to us," I said. "Don't intercept." Then I issued the orders. The company accounts first. Every operating account held under the Mercer Family Irrevocable Trust, of which I was the sole trustee with unilateral authority to modify access. A single authorization call to the primary banking contact would revoke Garrett's credentials across all linked accounts within minutes. The company-issued credit cards would be canceled in the same window. Within 30 minutes, every financial instrument Garrett Voss held through Mercer Capital would be inaccessible and non-functional. He would not be able to clear a hotel bar tab with a Mercer card. Theodore Baxter next. 35 minutes to the Ritz-Carlton's main entrance with the full legal team and the complete documentation package. I needed him inside the building before 8:45. Then, Desmond Pruitt. Captain Pruitt was 51 years old, 22 years with the Chicago Police Department, currently commanding a major crimes task force that had been running in parallel with the FBI's Morozov financial network investigation for 6 months. He had the complete file. Ingrid had delivered a copy 3 weeks prior through established channels sufficiently in advance that the federal coordination was already in place. What he needed tonight was confirmation that the subject was in the building, the flight number, and the departure time. Ingrid gave him all 3 before I finished the sentence. "Everything activates in 30 minutes, I said. "Nothing before that. I want him comfortable. I'll coordinate from here." A pause. "Sloan, are you ready?" I looked at the briefcase in my hand, at the concrete column beside me, at the long row of vehicles extending into the low-lit distance of the parking structure. Indifferent and impersonal as only underground spaces ever truly are. 8 floors above this level in a room full of crystal chandeliers and 300 people who had come for a party. A man was accepting an introduction he had spent 4 years constructing. "I've been ready since July 15th, I said. I closed the briefcase, walked out of the alcove along the wall of parked vehicles past the storage shelf where all of this had started 40 minutes earlier, toward the elevator bank at the far end of the structure. I pressed the call button. The doors opened without delay. I stepped in. As the elevator doors came together behind me, the building's audio system carried something down from the floors above, faint at first, then sharper as the system equalized. An amplified voice, energized in the way of someone comfortable with a microphone, and a large room filling the upper floors with the particular warmth of formal announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the visionary leader who made all of this possible tonight, Mr. Garrett Voss." 300 people applauded through 8 floors of concrete and steel and elevator shaft and arrived at me as something between a rumble and a wave. I watched the floor numbers on the panel above the door. 6, 7, 8. The parking garage elevators opened into the lobby at ground level. and the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton Chicago arrived all at once, a full sensory event after nearly an hour of concrete and fluorescent cold. White marble underfoot, lit from below to a soft and sourceless luminescence. Crystal chandeliers, the largest suspended in the center of the atrium with the particular deliberateness of something designed to be the first thing seen and the last thing forgotten. White lilies arranged at intervals along the front desk, long-stemmed and precise, nothing excessive about them. And from somewhere in the floors above, traveling down through open atrium space and the building's conditioned air, the sound of a piano playing something so practiced, it had long since stopped requiring thought. I crossed the marble with the briefcase at my side. From the alcove near the elevator bank serving the upper floors, two figures came forward. Ingrid moved ahead with the specific economy she had always used when time was actual, rather than approximate. Behind her half a step, Theodore Baxter. At 49, Theodore Baxter looked precisely like what he was, a man who had spent 2 decades inside the legal architecture of complex private companies and acquired through that work the particular quality of stillness that belongs only to people who have learned the difference between problems that benefit from urgency and problems that punish it. He had been my father's primary outside counsel since before I had been old enough to attend board meetings on my own authority, the person Ellsworth Mercer had called, not for routine matters, but for the things that actually mattered. Salt and pepper at the temples. A charcoal suit that was fractionally more formal than the hour technically required. He was carrying a black folio under one arm, which meant his team was already deployed, and everything was in sequence. He looked at me when I approached and nodded, once the nod of someone who had reviewed the file and found it complete. I didn't speak to him yet. There was no preamble that felt adequate. Accounts, I said to Ingrid. Frozen. Garrett's Mercer Capital credentials were revoked across all linked operating accounts at 8:14. She matched her steps to mine without breaking her sentence. Company-issued cards declined as of the same time. The IT team remotely locked the server at 8:18. Garrett's administrative access is gone. Tatum Reeve and Clifton Greaves have no active credentials on any system. Not the financial records, not the correspondence archive, not the calendar. Nothing they can access, nothing they can delete. Pruitt, Captain Pruitt confirmed departure from the 11th District at 8:21. 6 officers, 2 federal agents accompanying under joint operation authorization. 14 minutes out from this building as of 8:24. Possibly less traffic on Lake Shore is clear. Theodore stepped forward as we reached the elevator. The hotel's AV operations manager cooperated once we presented the federal investigation documentation. His team gave us access to the ballroom presentation system at 7:45. We are connected, staged, and ready. The FBI's liaison for the Northern District confirmed via secure line at 8:07. They will coordinate their on-site presence with Captain Pruitt's team and treat tonight as the operational trigger for their broader case. I pressed the call button and waited. Operational trigger, I said, meaning they're using tonight to close the network. Yes. Theodore's voice held neither drama nor apology, just calibrated precision. Other locations are under active surveillance. When the arrests here execute, those locations move simultaneously. Tonight isn't only the end of Garrett's operation, it finalizes the evidentiary chain for the Morozov network case as a whole. The elevator opened. The 3 of us stepped in. The lobby disappeared behind the closing doors. I processed what Theodore had just told me in the quiet of the ascent. Garrett had spent 4 years building a structure. The FBI had spent 6 months building a structure around his. Everyone had been working toward the same night without having arranged that fact across a table. He had planned a disappearance. He had not planned for the possibility that the city he intended to disappear from had already defined the precise conditions under which his departure would become impossible. The 8th floor opened into a private service corridor running parallel to the main ballroom entrance, staff access quieter, lit with the same warm wall sconces as the public hallways, but without the foot traffic and the ceremony. Through the walls, the event was already clearly audible. The layered frequency of 300 conversations. Music. The particular bright note of ice against crystal at the moment someone accepts a fresh drink. And something else. A voice I had heard every week for 4 years, carrying at the volume Loretta Voss used when she was holding court, rather than conversing. I go in first, I said. Alone. Neither of you moves until I signal. Ingrid's expression didn't change. She had been with me long enough to understand that when I used that particular register of voice, debate extended the timeline rather than improving the outcome. They have 4 years of pattern recognition when it comes to how I enter a room, I said. They know what I look like when I am afraid. They know what I look like when I am adjusting to occupy as little space as possible. They have trained themselves through those 4 years to look past me the moment I appear, because looking past me has never cost them anything. I paused. That is the only advantage I have had the entire length of this marriage, and I am not going to lose it by walking through that door beside a lawyer. Theodore Baxter, who had built his career on the principle that the well-prepared party wins, said nothing, because he understood that I was right. Signal me, I said, and you'll know it when it happens. I looked down at the dress. Pale champagne selected by a man who had wanted the woman beside him to be decorative without being prominent. He had stood in a boutique on Oak Street, pulled it from the rack with what had looked like consideration, and presented it as a choice when it was actually an instruction. I had worn it without comment. I had worn a version of this dress in one form or another, in tone and in posture, and in the space I was permitted to take in rooms he occupied for 4 years. What he had never understood, because it had never occurred to him to consider what the invisible accumulate was, what 4 years of invisibility produces. Not damage, not erosion. A precise and detailed knowledge of how a room works when it believes no one significant is watching. He had dressed me for disappearance. He had handed me, without intending, to the only thing in that building they would not be prepared for. I left Ingrid and Theodore in the corridor and walked to the end of the hall alone. The ballroom's side entrance was a set of double brass-handled doors, the kind designed to open inward with minimum effort. Alongside the frame, a floor-to-ceiling glass panel narrow, set for sightline clearance, let staff assess the room's movement before entering. Through the doors, the event was clear now, the specific pitch of the party at its comfortable middle hour, the point where no one watches the entrance anymore, because everyone who matters has already arrived and been absorbed into the room's current. And through it all, Loretta Voss speaking to someone at the volume she reserved for statements she wanted heard beyond their intended recipient. The future of the Voss family has never looked more certain than it does tonight. Loretta Voss, describing a future, in a building where her son's financial access had been revoked 14 minutes ago. I placed my palm flat against the push plate. In the glass panel beside the door, I looked at the woman reflected there. Pale champagne dress standing completely straight. A black briefcase at her side held without effort. Not a tremor in the arm, not a hesitation in the posture. Someone who had arrived at this door having already made every decision that mattered, and now simply had to walk through it. I didn't recognize her immediately. That was the thing about her. She didn't look like the person I had spent the last 4 years learning to be so that everyone in that room would underestimate her. She looked like someone older than that. Someone I thought I had lost access to years ago in a house in Lincoln Park. Somewhere between the first dinner at which I said nothing and the first apology I made for something I had not done. She looked like Sloane Ann Mercer. I inhaled once, exhaled once, and pushed the door. The ballroom door opened, and I stepped into the world that had spent 4 years finding ways to ensure I took up as little of it as possible. The Grand Ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Chicago held that particular quality of spaces built at maximum deliberate scale crystal chandeliers positioned across a ceiling high enough to render the crowd below briefly proportional to their own ambitions. Long tables in white linen bearing flower arrangements taller than the guests seated around them and across the full width of the far wall. In clean white sans serif letters against a dark backdrop panel, Voss Interiors, LLC, Grand Opening. The live band had paused between numbers in the moment of my entrance, which meant the room was running on its own. Sustained frequency, 300 voices layered over each other, ice against crystal. The particular low note of a party at its comfortable middle hour when everyone who is coming has already arrived and the space has absorbed them. In the first 3 seconds after that door opened, nearly every one of those 300 people turned to look at what had come through it. They saw a woman in a pale champagne dress carrying a black briefcase walking into the room, as though the question of her right to be there had never occurred to her. The first recognition came from the right side of the floor. A woman in a black evening gown with gold jewelry at the collar and wrists, who moved out from a table near the entrance with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent decades converting social situations into personal jurisdiction. Loretta Voss crossed the marble in 8 steps, and positioned herself at a distance calculated to benefit the surrounding table's ability to hear clearly. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" She kept her volume elevated, not shouting but performing. The voice of a woman who had learned that witnesses were essential to authority. "The family has been in this room since 7 o'clock. 7. And you come in looking like—" The gesture toward the briefcase managed to convey both disgust and the suggestion that its presence was a personal affront. "Like you've come from a business meeting, into a black tie reception. Do you understand who is in this room tonight? Do you have any understanding at all of what this evening represents for this family?" In 4 years of this marriage, every confrontation with Loretta Voss had concluded with some version of a concession from me. Not always direct apology, sometimes a deflection, a softening. A small verbal accommodation that gave her the thing she had come to extract. It had been perhaps the most consistent feature of those 4 years. Reliable enough that by year 3 I had stopped noticing I was producing it. I looked at her. I said nothing at all. Not the silence of someone suppressing a response, managing an impulse. Simply nothing. The complete absence of the apology she had arrived to collect. No qualifier. No explanation. No concession of any kind. She drew breath to continue. Across the room, the band began tuning for the next set. Garrett came off the side of the stage, already in motion before I had cleared the doorway. His expression calibrated for exactly these situations. Warm smile, open posture. The particular ease of a man moving through a room that had been built in his honor tonight. He distributed that smile to 2 separate conversations as he crossed the floor, and by the time his hand reached my arm, it had narrowed at the edges by a degree visible only to me. The grip was precise and applied without announcement. To anyone watching from the nearest table, a husband making contact with a late-arriving wife, a possessive kind of welcome. The affectionate claim of a man pleased to see someone. His fingers delivered their own separate message. "Why did you bring that in here?" 4 words with no room for questions. I thought, Reginald Wentworth has been in this building since 7:30. He didn't look at me while he said it. His eyes were moving through the room the way they always did in these situations, tracking which faces were turned our way and managing the geometry of what they could and couldn't hear. "You're going to set that case somewhere out of sight, and you're going to go to your seat. And you're going to stay there without saying a word to anyone. Am I clear?" From the stage steps, Delia descended. Her dress was white structured, sequined across the bodice in a way that caught every chandelier in the room, a dress chosen specifically to ensure that from any viewing angle she registered first, longest, and most. She had the room. She had the evening her brother had funded for her, with money drawn from accounts that had been frozen for 31 minutes. I said business formal. Her eyes moved from my face to the briefcase twice. Not. Another gesture implying the entire situation was an aesthetic failure, whatever this is. I looked at all 3 of them. Loretta standing in her gown, waiting for the apology the silence was supposed to produce. Garrett with his hand on my arm, and an expression that had more in common with enforcement than affection. Delia in her sequins, already composing the version of this story she would tell later. Then I looked beyond them. The room had begun to concentrate in its attention, individual conversations dimming at the perimeter. Heads turning with the instinct of people who have sensed that something at the center of a room is operating at a different temperature than the surrounding air. At a table nearer than I had estimated, Reginald Wentworth, 64 years old, commercial real estate money from the Great Lakes corridor. A man who had not built what he had built by failing to read rooms accurately. Beside him, Sterling Wentworth, 29, the young man who had until that very evening been planning to marry the woman in the white sequined dress. Both of them were looking. Not at Loretta. Not at Garrett. At me. I produced a faint smile. For no one in particular. Then I turned toward Garrett and leaned in close enough that his mother and sister could not draw the words from where they stood. Far enough that the nearest tables would read the posture as intimacy rather than confrontation. When I spoke, my voice was at the register I had developed over 4 years of saying almost nothing. Level quiet, producing no sound that carried beyond the single person it was addressed to. "Honey," I said. He processed the word. It was not what he had been waiting for. The valet downstairs had a package tonight, left for Mrs. Voss. I gave it a breath. A black briefcase. Another breath, the measured kind. The kind that gives a sentence room to land before the next one begins. With 2 business-class boarding passes to Zurich, tonight, the 11:45 departure. One more beat, and everything else that was inside it. I watched his face. The change was not theatrical. Nothing collapsed dramatically or announced itself. What happened was quiet and for that reason entirely real. Color left the skin along his jaw in a way that had nothing to do with the room's lighting, a specific kind of internal withdrawal, something pulling away from the surface. His mouth opened by approximately half an inch. His fingers on my arm, still in position, still maintaining the geometry of the gesture, loosened, without him appearing to notice they had done so. His eyes held mine, and inside them, for the first time in 4 years of watching him look at me, I saw something I had not seen before. It was the fear of a person who has just understood that the game they believed they were winning ended before they knew it had started. I took one step back from him, turned right. Delia was still standing in her sequined dress, arms slightly crossed, wearing the expression of someone composing a grievance. I opened the side compartment of the briefcase and removed a white envelope sealed, tied at the center with a cream ribbon bow, the kind of presentation that reads at a distance as a gift. I held it out to her, a housewarming present for Voss Interiors, Delia. My voice carried to the nearest tables without effort. Open it right now. A pause. One beat clearly intentional, filling exactly the space required for every person within range to stop their own conversation. I think everyone in this room is going to want to see what's inside. Before I show you what happens when that envelope opens, comment "Open it" below if you're ready for what comes next. 300 people in that room had no idea what was inside. In about 60 seconds, neither will Delia Voss. Tell me you're still here. One note: what follows includes fictional elements shaped for storytelling and reflection. If this type of content doesn't sit right with you, this is the right moment to step away. No judgment, truly. She didn't reach for it gently. Delia took the envelope the way she accepted most things I offered, with the particular grip of someone who has never questioned their entitlement to what they are reaching for. The cream ribbon came loose in a single pull. The flap opened. She unfolded the page inside with the practiced efficiency of someone who expected its contents to be either irrelevant or briefly manageable. She was wrong on both counts. The document was printed on heavy legal stock, formatted with the spare precision of paperwork that doesn't require ornamentation because its contents make a sufficient impression on their own. In the upper left, in clean black lettering, Victor Morozov, Capital Partners. Below that, 3 lines in a font measurably larger than the surrounding text. Debt collection notice. Outstanding balance, $8,300,000. Payment due, October 31st, 2024. Beneath those numbers, in the blunt language that legal correspondence uses when it intends to leave no room for misreading, warning. Collateral instruments designated by debtor include family residential assets and professional standing. Failure to satisfy the outstanding balance by the stated date will initiate collateral recovery proceedings without further notice. Delia read it. I watched the color leave her face in 2 distinct stages, the surface first, then deeper, the way warmth leaves a room when its source has been cut off. Her hands adjusted their grip on the page twice. Her mouth opened before she had decided what her voice was going to say. What is this? It was not quite a question. It was the sound a person makes when they encounter a sentence that doesn't fit any category their experience has prepared them to process. Loretta was beside her daughter before Delia had finished the words. She took the page without asking, a motion of such automatic authority that Delia simply let it go and read it in approximately 12 seconds. When she looked up and found Garrett, the expression on her face was something I had not seen from Loretta Voss in 4 years of watching her look at her son. It was the specific quality of unrecognition. The look of a person who has encountered something that doesn't match the version of reality they have committed themselves to holding. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Garrett moved. He covered the distance between us in 4 steps, and everything that had been carrying his face through the evening, the warmth, the control, the performance of a man entirely at ease in his own room, had shed itself entirely by the time he arrived. What was underneath was not rage. It was something less organized, less predictable. You fabricated this. He said it at a pitch slightly too elevated for the distance between us, which meant the 2 nearest tables absorbed every word cleanly. You had this made. You had this made to destroy this evening. His hand came up, reaching for my arm, the same grip, less controlled than before. He did not complete the reach. Mr. Voss. Theodore Baxter had positioned himself beside me with a timing that came from having read the room correctly and decided precisely when to enter it. He was 1 step closer to Garrett than I was, which was exactly where he needed to be. Remove your hand. Now. His voice carried no elevation whatsoever, not louder than a normal conversation, and for that reason, unlike anything else currently happening in that corner of the room. "This is the only time I will say it. It is not a request." Garrett's arm came down. The room had changed. Not in any single visible way. The chandeliers were still lit. The tables were still set. The flower arrangements were still taller than the guests surrounding them. But the frequency had shifted in the specific way that happens when 300 people simultaneously realize they are no longer guests at a party. They are witnesses to something that is going to matter outside this building. The conversations nearest to us had closed down entirely. Further back in the middle section of the room, individual pockets of ongoing dialogue were becoming aware of the silence radiating from the center and were quieting to listen. 2 men at a table to the right had their phones in hand, holding them with the particular posture of people who were not photographing the moment, but calling someone who needed to know immediately. A couple near the east bar, I could see them in my peripheral, moved quietly and without announcing their departure toward the exit doors. The room as a whole was deciding what it was. Reginald Wentworth stepped forward from the left side of the floor. He moved without urgency. 64 years old, the weight of the Great Lakes commercial real estate corridor behind him, the kind of man whose pace in any given situation communicates, without announcement, that he has already decided and is now simply executing the decision. Sterling came 2 steps behind him, watching his father navigate with the focused attention of someone still in the process of learning how rooms like this actually operated. Reginald stopped at the edge of the open space that had formed organically around the 6 of us, the radius of cleared floor that appears in any room when something has become the center of it. He looked at Garrett. "Before this evening moves any further," he said, "I think you owe the people in this room an explanation of those numbers." Garrett's voice had recovered something of its former register, not the full warmth, but the surface of competence. "Reginald, this is a misunderstanding. Sloan has been building a case against me for months. These documents are part of a pattern of—" Reginald raised one hand. Not high, just enough. The hand of a man who has sat across from too many tables to find incomplete arguments worth the time they required to hear out. He said nothing else to Garrett. He turned. And he looked at me directly and without the particular social deflection that had characterized every previous time Reginald Wentworth had been in the same room as Sloan Voss and found reasons to address her husband instead. In that look was a man recalibrating. 18 months ago, he had agreed to the prospect of Sterling entering the Voss family, partly because the Mercer Capital Association had seemed structurally sound leadership in place, capital accessible. The kind of stability that made a merger between families feel like a reasonable business decision as much as a personal one. In those 18 months, he had not looked at Sloan Mercer carefully. She had not presented herself as someone who required careful looking. She had been in pale dresses at the edges of rooms, deferring, absorbing, leaving no impression of operational authority. He was looking now. At me. Then at Theodore Baxter, whom he knew by professional reputation well enough to understand what his presence in this room at this hour in this position signified. Then at Ingrid Cassell, standing near the main entrance with the stillness of someone who had been in exactly the right place for exactly the right amount of time. He performed the calculation that 64 years of correctly reading situations had made second nature. Ms. Mercer. The name he chose was not the one on the marriage certificate. He didn't deliberate about it. It was simply the right name for the person in front of him, and Reginald Wentworth had not built what he'd built by using the wrong names. "I believe you are the appropriate person to address tonight." One step toward me, away from Garrett, precise, unhurried, irreversible. 300 people watched Reginald Wentworth make his choice. I held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then I turned my head slightly deliberately toward the main entrance on the far side of the room, where Ingrid Cassell was watching and waiting. The overhead lights in the grand ballroom dropped by half. At the far end of the room, the large projection screen which had displayed the Voss Interiors LLC logo all evening against its clean dark background began to fade, as though something upstream had been interrupted, as though its source had simply stopped. 1 second. 2. Then it came back, fully bright, everything visible to every person in the room. It was not the company logo. It was a certified copy of the Mercer Capital Group Articles of Incorporation and Shareholder Registry, stamped and authenticated by the Illinois Secretary of State's office. The document filled the screen from edge to edge, every line legible from the back row, every number confirmed. In the center of that screen in type, large enough to be read without effort from 50 feet away. Majority shareholder, Sloan Ann Mercer, 85% ownership interest. Director-level contract employee Garrett Voss. Date of filing, November 14th, 2020. The room went from murmur to something closer to silence. Not complete silence. 300 people don't go completely silent, but the particular concentrated quiet of people reading something in unison and processing it at different speeds. Delia moved first. That's fabricated. Her voice had the quality of a statement she needed to be true, rather than one she had confirmed. That document is fabricated. Ingrid stepped out from beside the door with the calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this sentence. Certified copy. Illinois Secretary of State's Office. Filing date November 14th, 2020. The filing number is on the lower right of the screen. Anyone with a phone and access to the SOS Business Registry can verify it in approximately 45 seconds. She didn't look at Delia when she said it. She didn't need to. No one verified it. Everyone believed it. The screen changed. The next image was a photograph taken in the parking garage lower level of this building less than 2 hours ago from a phone camera under fluorescent light. A black leather briefcase open. Inside it, 3 red velvet boxes, 2 boarding passes in a clear sleeve, and a collection of documents fanned across the case's interior. The camera had captured the top line of the central document, clearly irrevocable transfer of title and a property address in Zurich. The room read it, then reread it. The screen changed again. This slide was structured like a financial audit summary column headers across the top rows of data beneath. Dates, amounts, receiving account numbers, bank names, 23 vendor entries, each with a corresponding transaction figure, each figure below $250,000. The column on the far right showed a rolling total. By the 14th row, that total had passed 20 million. By the 23rd, it read $47,200,000, 18 months of transfers, documented with the specificity of bank records that carry routing numbers and confirmation codes. Below the table, a single line. All 23 receiving entities confirmed as shell corporations. Registered beneficial owner Hector Bain. The slide held for 8 seconds. The screen changed. The 4th document was the one Delia had read from the envelope 20 minutes ago, but now projected at full scale, every line available to 300 sets of eyes simultaneously. Victor Morozov Capital Partners. $8,300,000. October 31st, 2024. And at the bottom in a signature block that the room could read clearly, Garrett Voss. His signature. His date. Garrett moved toward the microphone stand at the edge of the stage. He reached it. He gripped the stem with both hands. "What you are looking at," he said into a microphone that still worked because Ingrid's team had only changed the visual feed, not the audio system, and he must have thought that was an oversight. But it was not. Is a coordinated and deliberate attack by a person who has been attempting to undermine this company's leadership for years. These documents have been assembled selectively and presented without context. I am asking everyone in this room to. Not a single hotel staff member moved. Not the floor coordinator near the east entrance. Not the event manager who had spent the previous 4 hours ensuring this evening ran smoothly. Theodore Baxter had met with the hotel's general manager at 7:45 and presented documentation sufficient to ensure that from that point forward, no instruction from Garrett Voss carried operational weight inside this building. The staff had been briefed. They understood the situation. They remained in position and did nothing. Garrett continued speaking into a microphone held by a stand that had become a prop. At the VIP table nearest the main screen, a man in a gray suit stood. Clifton Greaves, 61 years old, vice chairman of Mercer Capital's board. The man whose signature appeared on the approval documents for every audit committee decision of the last 3 years had made in the last 90 seconds. The specific calculation of someone who has assessed their options and selected the one that preserves the most going forward. He stood with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who intended his rising to look like a natural decision to step outside. Theodore Baxter was beside him before he completed his 3rd step. "Mr. Greaves." Theodore placed one hand on the man's shoulder, brief, firm, unhurried. "The evening isn't finished. I think you should stay where you are." A pause. "Captain Pruitt is going to want to speak with you. He'll appreciate that you were easy to locate." Clifton Greaves sat back down. In the center of the room, Garrett was still at the microphone, still speaking. I had stopped tracking the words because the words no longer had a room to land in. His audience had become 300 people who were reading bank routing numbers on a screen and drawing their own conclusions. I watched his eyes instead. I watched them move across the room past the main tables toward the far right, where the secondary press tables had been arranged near the service corridor entrance. There, half visible between a column and the edge of a table, Tatum Reeve was seated. The dress she had chosen for the evening was dark, understated in a way that was not her usual aesthetic, the choice of someone who had not planned to be noticed tonight. Garrett's eyes found her. In the half-second that followed, something moved across his face, a signal without words directed at the side door 10 feet from where Tatum sat. An instruction delivered through eye contact between two people who had spent long enough in coordination to have developed the shorthand for it. Tatum looked at him. Then she looked at the side door. Then her eyes dropped to the small clutch bag resting in her lap. Inside it, I knew, because Ingrid had confirmed it 3 weeks ago, was a USB drive containing 46 audio recordings, 6 months of financial correspondence, and 2 video files that the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois was waiting to receive as the evidentiary centerpiece of a federal case, already largely built around everything else she had already provided. Tatum did not stand, did not move toward the door, did not do anything Garrett's eyes had asked her to do. The screen continued its quiet, thorough, merciless work. Then Garrett looked at her again. Not a signal this time, not an instruction. A look. The kind two people exchange when the architecture between them has given way, and there is nothing left to transmit except the recognition of what has happened. Tatum Reeve looked back at him for exactly 1 second. Then slowly and with full deliberateness she stood up. She walked toward Ingrid without looking at Garrett. 40 feet measured. Unhurried, the specific pace of someone executing a decision already made in full, rather than one still being formed as they moved. The room watched her the way rooms watch things that have become inevitable. Garrett's voice found her at approximately the midpoint. Tatum. Only the name. Then don't. The word landed in a room that had in the last 12 minutes become very good at hearing small things clearly. What 300 people in formal wear registered was a man addressing his mistress in public by name, with the tone of someone who has considerably more at stake with that particular person than with anyone else currently in the building. Not his wife, not his legal team, not the board members seated at the near tables, the woman walking toward the opposite corner of the room. Half the conversations that had risen again during the slide presentation went quiet. Tatum stopped 2 steps from Ingrid. She opened the clutch. She removed the drive, small black, unremarkable as an object, and held it in the way of someone presenting evidence rather than surrendering it. When she spoke, she addressed the room. What is on this drive is the complete private correspondence between Garrett Voss and myself relating to the 23 vendor entities used to route funds out of Mercer Capital over the past 18 months. Account numbers for the Zurich deposits, the full extraction timeline and the departure route he intended to use tonight, and the complete documentation of his plan to introduce fabricated evidence implicating his wife in the opening phase of the investigation, including the specific documents carrying her forged signature and the journalist contact intended to seed the story. She did not pause for effect. She paused for precision. I finalized a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois 3 weeks ago. Tonight is its public completion. She extended the drive toward Ingrid. Ingrid received it with both hands, a gesture she used infrequently, reserved for things that carried weight proportional to their physical size. The room did not respond immediately. 300 people in the specific silence of simultaneous recalibration, not the silence that follows surprise, but the one that follows confirmation. When something half understood or long suspected has finally been stated with precision, and there is nothing left to dispute. Garrett turned the word over before he used it. You're betraying me. Not a wounded question. No personal grief in it. The observation of a strategist who has just watched the key structural component of the night's plan separate itself from the structure and cross the floor. Tatum looked at him. I was never loyal to you, Garrett. Loyalty implies a commitment I never made. Her voice held the temperature of someone stating a correction, not delivering a verdict. I am a person who calculates. Tonight, the calculation resolved. I moved accordingly. She stepped back, took her place beside Ingrid with no additional ceremony. Garrett turned. And for the first time that evening, for what I understood watching it happen was, in fact, the first time in approximately 4 years he looked at me. Not the look he had maintained across dinner tables and boardroom presentations and social occasions, which was always the look of someone tracking a variable in a running calculation. Something different and less organized. the look of a man encountering a situation for which he had not in any of his planning prepared. He opened his mouth. "Mrs. V." He stopped. Not deliberately. Something interior had interrupted the sentence, the absence I understood of the version of me he had been addressing internally for 4 years. The version that existed as a function in his planning. She wasn't there. The person standing in front of him was something he had never actually oriented himself toward. I gave him nothing. No correction. No assistance. Then I spoke. "Sloan Mercer. Level precise, nothing added. That is my name. It has always been my name. It appears on every document that actually governs this company, the Lincoln Park House. Every asset you spent 4 years positioning yourself around. The Mercer Family Irrevocable Trust. The Mercer Residential Trust. The original director-level employment agreement that established what you were and what you were not inside this organization." I looked at him without any of the difficulty that looking at him had required for the previous 4 years. "Use it correctly. It would be the first time." He said nothing. He stood in front of 300 people surrounded by evidence that had outlasted his planning, with his mistress standing beside his wife's attorney, with the board member he had appointed to protect him, refusing to make eye contact from across the room, with his mother still holding a debt collection notice she had been unable to put down for 15 minutes, and he produced no sentence. The woman he had studied before approaching her at a charity event 5 years ago. The woman he had handed a pale dress and a set of implicit instructions about the space she was permitted to occupy. The woman he had made the organizing center of 4 years of extraction, while never once orienting himself toward her as a person who existed independently of that function. She was standing 3 feet away using her own name in her own voice, and Garrett Voss had nothing left to say to her. From beyond the ballroom walls, through glass and concrete and however many floors separated this room from Lakeshore Drive, the sound arrived. Not a single vehicle. Multiple. Not the incidental background of a city night, but the coordinated arrival of units that have a specific destination and know precisely where it is. The sirens built over approximately 4 seconds, and then were simply present, consistent, layered, getting no quieter. Garrett heard it. The color that remained in his face completed its departure in the specific manner of someone who has just processed that the final available option has been closed from the outside. The main ballroom doors at the far end of the hall came open. Desmond Pruitt entered, first 51 years old, 22 years with the Chicago Police Department. The particular build of a man who had walked into difficult rooms for long enough that the act of doing it had become something his body no longer required preparation for. Behind him, 6 officers in uniform and 2 federal agents in plain clothes fanned out across the width of the entrance, with the practiced efficiency of people who had reviewed the room layout before coming through the door. Pruitt moved to the center of the floor and addressed the room without raising his voice. "Chicago Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are executing federal arrest warrants for Garrett Voss, Tatum Reeve, and Clifton Greaves on charges including wire fraud, embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and fraudulent misrepresentation to obtain credit." He looked at no one in particular. He was simply providing the information the room required. "Please remain where you are." Garrett was already in a chair. He had not been pushed. There had not been directed there. At some point in the 20 seconds between the doors opening and Pruitt finishing his sentence, the structure that had been keeping him upright had simply resolved, and he had sat down the way things sit when they no longer have any reason to stay standing. One of the uniformed officers reached him, said something quiet and procedural, and Garrett extended his wrists without resistance. The click of the handcuffs in a room that had gone completely silent was the most specific sound I had heard all evening. Tatum was already standing with both arms slightly forward when the second officer reached her. Not a gesture of resignation. More the posture of someone completing a transaction they had agreed to 3 weeks prior and had been waiting with some patience to see through. Her expression was the one she had worn since setting down the USB drive, contained arranged offering nothing that wasn't already on the surface. Clifton Greaves had not waited for an officer to find him. He had apparently made a second attempt at the side exit in the 45 seconds between the doors opening and the federal agents' positions fully establishing themselves. It was the wrong 45 seconds to move. The agent who intercepted him did so without breaking stride, and Clifton Greaves was cuffed at the doorframe of the exit he hadn't reached, facing the wall of the corridor instead of the room behind him. On the far right of the floor against the wall nearest the VIP terrace, Loretta Voss had stopped standing. She was on the marble, not fallen, not collapsed in the dramatic sense, but simply no longer capable of the effort that standing had required. She sat with her back against the wall, both hands over her face, producing a sound that would not have been audible if the rest of the room had not gone completely still. The particular sound of someone crying who cannot afford to be heard, which means you hear every part of it. 66 years old, in a black gown with gold at the collar, sitting on hotel marble on the night that everything she had invested belief in turned out to have been built around a person who was largely a constructed performance. Sterling Wentworth was at the table near the stage. He had been there for perhaps 30 seconds when I noticed him. He did not speak. He reached across the white linen, picked up Delia's right hand gently with both of his, removed the engagement ring from her finger with the careful deliberateness of someone who does not want to cause additional harm in the act of ending something, and set it on the tablecloth. Centered, as though placement mattered, he looked at her once. Then he nodded to his father, who was already at the east exit. They left without a word. Delia looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked up at the full-width sign suspended at the far end of the room, the one that read, Voss Interiors LLC, Grand Opening. And I watched her understand in real time that the second line was never going to be true. They brought Garrett through the center of the room on the way to the main exit. He stopped when he reached me. 1 second, perhaps 2. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they can't categorize. 4 years of looking through me and past me and around me. And now, at the end of it, with nothing remaining of the plan that had organized those 4 years, he looked at me directly and found he had nothing to do with what he saw. I did not speak. Not because I had nothing to say, because I had already said everything that required saying. Every true thing was on that screen. Every legal thing was in those documents. Every personal thing had been spoken in my own name less than 10 minutes ago. What remained between us was not a conversation. It was a distance that had always been there, and was now simply visible. The officer at his elbow did not rush him. After 2 seconds, Garrett looked away, and they continued toward the exit. Silence, as it turned out, was still the most powerful language available to me. It always had been. The difference was that tonight I chose it. Captain Pruitt reached me after the last of the 3 was through the door. He angled himself so that his voice carried no further than the 2 of us. Miss Mercer. He used the right name without prompting. I need 5 minutes with you, somewhere private. A pause, the kind that precedes something specific. There is a detail about tonight that you're not yet aware of. The corridor was quiet, in the way corridors become quiet when everything important has moved to one side of a door and can only be heard through it. Pruitt positioned himself facing me, his back to the wall sconce, and spoke the way he had addressed the ballroom, without wasted volume, without preface. What I'm about to tell you is confidential, but you have the right to know it. He told me that for the past 6 months, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Chicago field office had been building a case against Viktor Morozov's financial network, the organization that operated illegal gambling locations, maintained layered shell corporation structures across 4 states, and laundered the resulting funds through commercial real estate acquisitions in Chicago and New York. The investigation had been running in parallel with the evidence Ingrid had gathered, without either operation knowing the precise state of the other until the coordination with Captain Pruitt 3 weeks ago. What happened in that room tonight, he said, was the triggering event for the wider operation. Simultaneous enforcement actions at 4 additional locations across Chicago are executing right now, and Viktor Morozov himself. A brief pause, the kind that precedes information still arriving in real time, is being taken into custody at his private residence in Lincoln Square as we speak. I process that. The man who had run a campaign designed to exhaust my father into his grave was at this precise moment sitting in his own home with federal agents at his door. There is one more thing. Pruitt's voice carried a specific quality, not hesitation, but the care of someone delivering something fragile. The pressure campaign directed at your father in the year before his death. The coordinated correspondence. The contract disruptions. The regulatory inquiry. He looked at me directly. That campaign is now formally within the scope of the federal investigation. I cannot make you promises about where it leads. The chain of causation is indirect, and the legal standard is high. But I can tell you with certainty that it will not be overlooked. Your father's name will be part of this case. I said nothing for a moment. I had spent 4 years inside a plan designed by a man who had calculated every variable, including the death of the person who built everything I was standing on. I had spent 3 months preparing to dismantle that plan. I had until this moment believed that tonight was the end of something, the resolution of a 4-year personal account. Pruitt had just told me it was something larger than that it had always been. "Thank you, Captain," I said. I went back through the door. The ballroom had the specific quality of a room that has witnessed something and is still absorbing it. Guests standing rather than seated. Conversations at a lower register than earlier in the evening, the evidence still glowing on the screen at the far end. I walked to the MC stand at the edge of the stage and picked up the microphone. The room found its way to silence on its own. "Good evening." I looked at the room, not at any single face, but at all of it. "My name is Sloan Mercer. For the past 4 years, I have been the sole controlling shareholder and true owner of Mercer Capital Group, the company my father built from nothing on the streets of this city." I spoke without notes. There was nothing I needed to remember. "I am formally notifying all board members, investors, and business partners present tonight. Garrett Voss is removed from all positions within this organization, effective immediately. Every financial loss incurred during his tenure will be pursued through every legal avenue available. Beginning tomorrow morning, I will be resuming direct management of my family's company. Thank you." No additional words, no performance. Just the truth spoken by a person who had been quiet long enough. Theodore Baxter started the applause. He was standing at the edge of the room, folio still under his arm, and he brought his hands together slowly and with the deliberate quality of someone marking something that mattered. It spread outward from him, table by table, across the room, until 300 people who had come for a different evening entirely were acknowledging the one they had instead received. I set the microphone down and stepped off the low platform. Ingrid was waiting. She said nothing. She had been with my family long enough to understand the difference between moments that required words and moments that required presence. I looked at her. "Call the building manager in Lincoln Park," I said. "I want the locks changed before anyone from the Voss family reaches the front door." She nodded once and reached for her phone. I looked up at the chandeliers, still lit, still exact, still entirely indifferent to the 4 hours that had passed beneath them. And for the first time in 4 years, I took a breath in that wasn't managing something, bracing for something, or preparing for the next thing that required endurance. My shoulders, for the first time in a very long time, held nothing. A year of Chicago passed. The city, as it always does, moved without acknowledging what had changed beneath it. Buildings were built. Deals were signed. People arrived by plane and left by the same. The lake held its position at the eastern edge of everything, indifferent to weather and to consequence alike. I moved forward too. The CEO office on the 38th floor of Willis Tower took up the building's northeast corner, full-height glass on 2 sides. The city arranged below in the particular horizontal way Chicago presents itself when observed from elevation. Morning light came in off the lake at this hour and made the room cleaner than it needed to be. The dark wood desk. The 3 folders stacked in precise alignment that Ingrid had placed there before I arrived, and on the far corner of the desk, in a simple silver frame, a photograph of my father taken the afternoon Mercer Capital signed its first contract in this city. He was standing in what was then a much smaller office in a much smaller building across town, smiling in the way of someone who has just understood that what they built is going to last. I stood at the window with a cup of chamomile tea and looked at Chicago running its morning below me. Navy suit hair, back, both feet on the floor, with no apology in the posture for any of it. A year ago, I had stood in a parking garage in a pale champagne dress chosen by someone else. The contrasts available to me were not subtle. Ingrid came in at 8:15, which was when she always came in. She set the Q3 financial report on the desk with the specific quiet of someone who already knows the contents and finds them satisfactory. Net profit increased 22.4% against the same quarter last year, she said. Comparative baseline adjusted for the restoration of the audit structure and the elimination of the vendor arrangements. She paused. 3 new strategic development partnerships signed this quarter, all reviewed through the reconstituted internal compliance framework. I nodded. Not with enthusiasm, with acknowledgement. 22% was not a celebration. It was what the company had always been capable of and had been prevented from demonstrating. It was a correction, not a result. There's also the periodic update, Ingrid said. She had established this practice herself 3 months after October, a standing briefing she maintained on her own initiative, not because I had asked for it, but because Ingrid Cassell had decided that no remaining element of that situation would be permitted to become a blind spot. I hadn't argued with this. I had learned some years ago not to argue with Ingrid's instincts about what required monitoring. Garrett Voss was sentenced in federal district court to 18 years, she said. Wire fraud, embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and fraudulent misrepresentation to obtain credit consolidated at sentencing. He is currently held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center here in Chicago pending transfer designation. A brief pause. There have been no visitors. His health has been declining since intake. I looked at the lake. Tatum Reeve received a 3-year sentence following the cooperation agreement's formal completion. Her counsel filed for early release consideration 6 weeks ago. That proceeding is ongoing. Ingrid's voice was consistent throughout, informational without editorial content, which was the right register for it. Clifton Greaves was convicted on all counts last spring: insider trading, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. He is awaiting the sentencing hearing. His resignation from every board position he held was tendered the week following his conviction. She turned a page. Viktor Morozov's federal case is in pre-trial proceedings on 14 counts, including racketeering money, laundering illegal gambling operation, and conspiracy. The U.S. Attorney's Office has indicated the pressure campaign against your father has been formally incorporated into the scope of the racketeering charges. She said it the same way she said everything else, precisely, without burdening it with additional weight, trusting that I understood the weight already. I did. None of what Ingrid had just recited produced anything identifiable in my face. Not satisfaction, not relief, not anything that could be mistaken for gloating or for grief. These were consequences consistent with actions, the kind of proportionality that a functioning system is supposed to produce, and periodically, imperfectly does. I had no performance to offer in response to that. Ingrid turned one more page, then she stopped. The pause was slight, barely a half-second. But I had known Ingrid Cassell for the majority of my adult life, and in that time I had learned to read her pauses in the way other people read expressions. This one meant that the next section of the report contained something she was allowing me to consent to, rather than simply proceeding through. I set the chamomile down on its coaster. I looked at the photograph of my father at the smaller office, the unsigned furniture. The smile of a man in the early chapters of something he didn't yet know would outlast him. Continue, I said. Not because I wanted to revisit any of it for its own sake, but because I needed to know before I stopped looking backward entirely that every part of what had happened had reached its ending. That there was nothing behind me still in motion. That when I turned back to the window and the city below it and the work that still waited on that desk, I was turning toward something that was genuinely ahead of me. I needed it to be finished. Continue, I said again quietly to the room. Ingrid continued, and I listened. Loretta Voss and Delia Voss left the Lincoln Park house the morning after the locks were changed, which was October 19th, which was to say, the morning after everything. They had taken what fit in a car. They were currently renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport. The debt collection proceedings on Garrett's personal assets were moving through the courts on schedule, with recoveries applied to the consolidated judgment. Loretta had taken on additional morning hours at a job I did not ask Ingrid to specify. Delia was completing an unpaid internship at a small design studio on the near north side. Voss Interiors LLC had its operating certificate revoked by the Illinois Secretary of State's office in February. The entire startup capitalization had been identified as funds originating from the embezzlement scheme and was absorbed into the frozen estate. There had been no grand opening. There would not be one. I let the last of it settle. Not because I needed time to process it. I had processed most of what Ingrid had just described before it happened, in the months when I was understanding the full shape of what Garrett had built, and therefore the full shape of what would remain when it came apart. I let it settle because some things deserve a moment of stillness before you close the cover on them. That's enough, I said. I stood and crossed to the window. Below 38 floors down, Chicago was doing what it does at 9:45 on a weekday morning in October, moving in all directions with no particular concern for what had happened in any given room the previous year. Close that file, Ingrid. A pause. The kind she rarely produced. You're certain? They're living with the consequences of their own choices, I said. That's their chapter in this story. And mine moved to a new page a long time ago. I turned back from the glass. Close it. She closed the tablet. I looked at the photograph on the desk. Ellsworth Mercer had been photographed in a room a fraction of the size of this one, in a building across town that no longer housed the same tenants, smiling in the specific way of someone who has just signed the first contract that told him the thing he was building was going to hold. The photo was more than 30 years old. He looked in it, like someone with a long way to go who didn't mind the distance. I had spent a year learning to look at him without grief as the first response. Grief was still there, it would always be there, the permanent footnote of loss. But it was no longer the first thing. What arrived first now was gratitude, uncomplicated and exact. He had not only left me a company, he had left me the understanding that legacy is not a building or a balance sheet. It is the accumulated record of right decisions made over time by a person of conscience. The company was evidence of that. The way he had conducted himself was evidence of that. The way I had chosen to fight with documentation instead of destruction, with truth instead of fabrication, was my own attempt to honor it. Ingrid, she looked up from the closed tablet. How many years did you work with my father? She considered the question as though it required precision. 19. Would you mind staying on for a few more decades? She looked at me. And for the first time since she had walked through the office door that morning with the Q3 report and the monitoring update and the precise informational delivery she had maintained through all of it, she smiled. Not a performance of warmth. The actual thing. A knock at the door. My assistant's voice professionally calibrated. Ms. Mercer, the San Francisco delegation is in the reception area. I picked up the briefcase from beside the desk. My briefcase chosen for function, and for the particular shade of cognac leather I had decided I liked. I adjusted the collar of the navy suit, glanced once more at the photograph, and walked with Ingrid toward the door. I stopped just before it. In the glass panel beside the frame, a woman was looking back at me, 36 years old. A suit she had chosen, a name she had kept, standing without apology for any of it. No permission required from anyone currently living, no last name borrowed from a man who had never understood whose name deserved the attention. Sloan Ann Mercer. If not for that cold Chicago night, the valet briefcase, the fluorescent light of a parking garage, the trap laid by a woman who had calculated herself right out of a life sentence by walking across a ballroom. With a USB drive, I would never have found my way back to the person looking at me through that glass. I would have kept dimming and dimming until there was nothing left to recover. The door opened. I walked through it. The elevator arrived without waiting. We stepped in. The doors closed, and in the polished surface opposite, I found the reflection once more, one last time in this telling. She was smiling. Not the cold, composed expression of October 18th, the one that had known what was coming and was built entirely for surviving it. Something different. Something that had no tactical application whatsoever. The smile of someone who had come a very long way and arrived. People often ask what I would have done differently. My answer spoken sooner. God moves justice forward, but he waits for us to stop being silent first. It took me 4 years to understand that. This story is built on family betrayal. The quiet kind, the kind that lives under the same roof, calls itself love, and takes from you anyway. Family betrayal rarely announces itself. It erodes, invisible until everything is already gone. Family revenge should never become the destination. I paid 4 years to reach mine, and it cost more than any settlement could reclaim. Don't be like me. Speak while you still have time. My view, family revenge is satisfying only until you count what it consumed, and family betrayal always carried warnings. We simply chose not to read them. If this story of family revenge moved you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. That's how we keep telling stories that matter. Note: upcoming stories contain fictional elements built to educate and illuminate the human experience. If that's not the content you are here for, step away, no judgment. Choose what serves you best. Thank you for staying until the very last word.
Thanks for your time today. I'll see you again in the next story.